Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling a really big one, the shifting global order.
Huge topic. And to help us navigate it, we're drawing on a fascinating conversation with Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Right, a name that definitely carries weight in international economics. His experience is just vast, advising multiple UN secretaries general.
Working with leaders across the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine, plus those professorships, he's seen a lot.
Exactly. And his insights, which he shared in a recent Krasno and C YouTube discussion, that's what we're really unpacking for you today.
Yeah, we've been through the transcript of that talk, and our goal really is to pull out the key takeaways from Professor Sachs's analysis.
We're looking at his perspective on this whole new global landscape, right? The roles of the U.S., China.
The complexities of the Ukraine war and, where things might actually be heading.
Think of this as your shortcut, basically, helping you understand these complex geopolitical, economic shifts without getting totally lost in the weeds.
Let's try anyway.
Okay, so let's dive straight into Trump's economic policies first. Specifically, that trade war with China. Sachs is pretty blunt here.
He really is. He calls those tariffs just chaos, plain and simple.
And he points to the cost, right? Trillions of dollars, that's market capitalization just wiped out because of it.
Trillions. And what's key to understand here is Sachs's fundamental belief, going back to, Adam Smith.
That trade is supposed to be mutually beneficial.
Exactly. That when countries trade, both sides generally stand to gain. And the market's reaction back then?
The stocks dropping, bonds.
Yeah, that negative reaction really highlighted how interconnected things are. And arguably, that's partly why those tariffs got paused initially.
But even with those pauses, Sachs is clear. A real trade war with China is, well, it's still happening.
Oh, yeah. He says neither side seems ready to fully back down. And he just dismisses this whole idea of decoupling.
Completely separating the U.S. and Chinese economies.
Right. He argues that's not a clever strategy at all, that the trade relationship, for all its problems, has largely been a win-win.
Which brings up that whole debate, doesn't it? Trade deficits, losing manufacturing jobs here in the U.S.
Which are definitely valid concerns. People feel those impacts. But Sachs offers a different lens.
How so?
He suggests that a trade deficit, importing more than you export, isn't automatically proof that other countries are cheating.
Okay. So what is it then, in his view?
He frames it more as reflecting that the U.S., as a nation, is spending more than it's earning.
Ah, the national credit card analogy.
Pretty much. And a big chunk of that imbalance, he points to the U.S. government's own hefty budget deficit.
Huh. So it's interesting how he sort of shifts the focus, maybe not blame exactly, but the focus.
Away from just pointing fingers at other countries and towards looking at our own fiscal policies.
And he even brings up the U.S. undermining the WTO, the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, by blocking appointments to its appellate court, its top court for trade disputes.
He sees a contradiction there, like demanding fair trade but weakening the system meant to ensure it.
Precisely. He even references Jesus' teaching on hypocrisy, applying it to international policy, basically saying, look in the mirror first.
Wow. So his argument is that the U.S. needs to, well, look at its own actions and support the international systems it helped create.
Instead of acting unilaterally based on, a declared national emergency over trade, this has big implications for global economic stability.
Okay, let's shift then to the incredible sensitive topic of the Ukraine war. Sachs offers a pretty unconventional perspective here.
Very unconventional, especially on how it started. He actually sees Trump's instinct to pull back from Ukraine as recognizing it was becoming a loser situation for the U.S., to use Sachs' term.
And the origins. He says it didn't just start in 2022.
No, he argues the roots go back 30 years, 3 decades of U.S. policy, specifically NATO enlargement.
Expanding NATO eastward.
Right. He talks about those alleged promises made to Gorbachev and later Yeltsin that NATO wouldn't expand.
The Baker and Genscher comments.
Exactly. And then he points to the 2008 Bucharest summit. That's where NATO formally stated Ukraine and Georgia will become members eventually, a key moment for Sachs.
He also brings up 2014, doesn't he? The overthrow of Viktor Yanukovych.
Yes, the Ukrainian president who wanted more of a neutral path. Sachs calls it a coup and argues it had active U.S. support.
Which is a highly contested view.
Oh, absolutely. He knows that. But he points to things like that leaked phone call with Victoria Nuland as evidence of U.S. involvement in shaping Ukraine's politics back then.
And this, in his narrative, leads to Russia's actions, like annexing Crimea.
He explains their perspective as reacting to NATO potentially moving closer to their crucial Black Sea naval base in Crimea, a major strategic concern for them.
He notes the Western reaction back then was relatively muted, which some argue might have.
Emboldened Putin, perhaps? That's an interpretation.
But Sachs is careful, right, to distinguish between Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion in 2022.
Yes, very careful. He does not justify the 2022 invasion, but he tries to provide context for why Russia might have felt increasingly threatened.
Like what?
He points to the U.S. pulling out of key arms treaties, the ABM Treaty, the INF Treaty.
Anti-ballistic missile, intermediate-range nuclear forces.
Right, and deploying those Aegis missile defense systems in places like Poland and Romania, systems Russia fears could be converted to offensive use.
And the possibility of those systems eventually being placed in Ukraine itself.
That was a major concern from the Russian viewpoint, potentially undermining their nuclear deterrent. Again, this is Sachs explaining the Russian perspective as he sees it.
What's quite striking, though, is his take on Russia's initial aims in 2022.
Yeah, he suggests the main goal at first might not have been massive territorial conquest, but actually forcing Ukraine into neutrality.
And he points to evidence.
He mentions President Zelensky himself initially saying Ukraine might consider neutrality, and then the Istanbul talks in March 2022.
Where a deal based on neutrality was supposedly close?
Reportedly very close. A joint communique was even drafted, outlining a neutral Ukraine with security guarantees.
But it fell apart, and Sachs suggests outside interference.
He alleges that the U.S. and U.K., specifically mentioning Boris Johnson visiting Kyiv, intervened to persuade Ukraine not to sign that deal.
He cites former Israeli PM Naftali Bennett, seeming to confirm that Western powers blocked a potential deal.
Yes, he references Bennett's account. Sachs also thinks the U.S. really underestimated Russia's ability to withstand economic sanctions.
So, connecting all that history to potential solutions now,
Yeah.
what does Sachs propose?
He outlines a kind of three-point plan.
Yeah.
First, Ukraine commits to neutrality, maybe like the Austrian model post-WWII.
Yeah.
Second, security guarantees for both Ukraine and Russia, ideally anchored in the UN Security Council.
And third, the really tricky part, territory.
Exactly. On Crimea, he suggests Russia sees it as non-negotiable. It's effectively Russian territory in their view now.
And the other 4 regions Russia claims.
There, he suggests looking back at the Minsk II agreement, that previous failed peace attempt for eastern Ukraine.
And he compares it to South Tyrol.
Yeah, the region in Italy with a large German-speaking population that has significant autonomy and cultural protections. He sees that maybe as a model for those contested regions in Ukraine, providing autonomy within Ukraine.
Interesting. He even speculates someone like Trump might just try and force some kind of deal along those lines.
He suggests Trump's transactional style might lead him to push for a settlement, maybe cutting through some of the existing positions.
Okay, let's broaden the lens now. The bigger global order. Who rules? Is it changing?
Sachs's view is clear. Yes, it's definitely changing. He sees a multipolar world.
Meaning power isn't just concentrated in one place anymore.
Right. It's distributed among several major players, the US, Russia, China, India. And he thinks potentially the EU, if it acts more cohesively.
And his preference is for multilateralism, countries working together.
Strongly, and a more empowered United Nations as the venue for that cooperation.
But he's critical of the U.S., feeling like it's struggling to accept this shift.
Yeah, he finds it striking. He mentions reading influential journals like Foreign Affairs and seeing this persistent framing of the world through a lens of American dominance or leadership being essential everywhere.
Whereas Sachs sees China, for example, differently.
He doesn't frame China as an inherent enemy or an inevitable threat. He pushes back against that Thucydides trap idea.
The idea that war is almost unavoidable when a rising power challenges an established one.
Exactly. Sachs emphasizes the potential for mutual benefit if relations are managed well, focusing on cooperation where possible.
He does acknowledge concerns, though, right? Like China overtaking the U.S. in shipbuilding or other key sectors.
Oh, yes, he acknowledges those realities, but his response isn't to gear up for conflict.
It's more about
diplomacy. Maintaining mutual deterrence, making sure war is unthinkable for both sides, but not adopting a war footing unnecessarily. Focusing on de-escalation.
And then there's Taiwan, another incredibly complex issue.
And Sachs's view here is also quite controversial. He talks about the one China policy.
which acknowledges Beijing's claim over Taiwan without endorsing it, while allowing unofficial U.S. relations with Taiwan.
Right. But Sachs goes further, suggesting that maybe the best way to protect Taiwan is actually for the U.S. not to intervene militarily and perhaps even reduce arms shipments.
That's really different from current U.S. policy. Strategic ambiguity.
Completely different. His argument, counterintuitive perhaps, is that dialing back the U.S. military posture might actually reduce the risk of conflict and better ensure Taiwan's long-term security and stability by lowering tensions. It's a provocative stance.
He also talks about the anxieties in Eastern Europe about Russia, which are obviously very real.
Absolutely acknowledges them. But again, his answer is diplomacy. He points to things like Georgia in 2008 and says we need to actually engage directly with Russia.
Ask them point blank about their security concerns and try to negotiate.
Yes. Have grown-up dialogue, as he puts it, even on difficult issues like the rights of Russian speakers in the Baltic states. Find ways to address concerns through talks, not just military posturing.
He brings up that historical tidbit, too. Putin apparently asking about Russia joining NATO around the year 2000.
Yeah, it's a fascinating point he makes. He suggests there was real resistance within parts of the U.S. security establishment back then.
Implying a consistent U.S. aim regarding Russia ever since 1991.
That's Sachs's interpretation that certain elements have consistently sought to prevent Russia from integrating normally into the European or Western sphere, preferring it weakened or contained. He contrasts this with Gorbachev and Yeltsin, who he says genuinely wanted normal relations.
So, wrapping up his main thoughts on the future.
He really reiterates that shift. It's happening towards a multipolar world. It's not really reversible in his view.
And the only way to navigate it safely is through
Multilateralism, strengthening the UN international cooperation. He also has this underlying belief in long-term economic convergence.
economies becoming more similar over time.
Yeah, leading eventually to a more balanced global economic landscape. But the immediate future, he warns, is dangerous if countries go it alone unilateralism or if vital checks and balances erode.
He even mentions the importance of the Federal Reserve's independence as one of those checks and balances.
Right. So if we boil down Professor Sachs' core arguments for you, it's a strong critique of those Trump trade policies, seeing them as harmful chaos. It's a deep, historical, and frankly controversial take on the Ukraine war's origins, pushing for neutrality as a solution.
And recognizing this undeniable shift to a multipolar world, which demands, in his view, a big change in U.S. foreign policy thinking.
Absolutely. With a constant drumbeat for diplomacy, for multilateralism, for cooperation over confrontation.
You know, for me, a real aha moment listening to his analysis was hearing those details about the Istanbul process back in March 2022.
How close they supposedly came to a neutrality deal.
Yeah. Whether you agree with his interpretation or not, it really makes you question the standard narrative of how things unfolded right after the invasion.
And that comparison he makes using the South Tyrol autonomy model as a potential framework for the contested regions in Ukraine, drawing on Minsk II.
It provides a concrete historical example. It shows there might be creative ways to think about resolving these incredibly difficult territorial disputes, focusing on self-governance and minority rights within existing borders.
Definitely food for thought. Hopefully this whole deep dive has given you a clearer, even if complex, picture of these huge geopolitical and economic issues, drawing on Sachs's specific perspective.
So this leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder. Considering the arguments Professor Sachs lays out, what's the single most impactful action the world's most influential power could genuinely take today to de-escalate one of these major international conflicts?
Yeah, try to think beyond the headlines and the usual policy talk. What alternative approach, maybe grounded in understanding the historical context and everyone's perspectives, could actually foster lasting peace? Something to mull over.